In the stillness before thought takes form, the soul begins its ancient remembering. Long before words were shaped by the tongue or beliefs carved into doctrine, an inner call moved through human hearts, urging them to look beyond the fragile walls of matter. This call is not loud, yet it is irresistible. It arises in moments of wonder, in quiet suffering, in the strange dissatisfaction that success cannot soothe. The seeker feels it as a gentle unrest, a divine homesickness that no worldly possession can satisfy. Thus begins the sacred journey, not outward into distance, but inward into truth. The path of seeking is not reserved for the learned or the renounced alone. It belongs equally to the farmer who pauses beneath the sky, the child who gazes with unclouded awe, and the weary soul who has tasted every pleasure yet remains unfulfilled. Each carries within the same spark, patiently waiting to be fanned into living realization. Seeking is not an act of escape from life, it is a deeper embrace of it. Through seeking, life is no longer endured but understood, no longer feared but befriended. As the seeker advances, questions grow more refined. What is the source of joy that appears without cause? Who is the silent witness behind thought and emotion? Why does love feel limitless when the heart forgets itself? These questions are not answered by argument, but by experience. The universe does not reveal its secrets to impatience. It opens itself gradually to sincerity, discipline, and devotion. Each sincere effort, however small, draws unseen assistance, as though the cosmos itself leans closer to listen. In the early stages, the seeker may imagine the divine as distant, enthroned beyond stars and time. Yet with persistence, a subtler understanding dawns. The sacred is not confined to temples or texts. It breathes in every atom, listens through every heartbeat, and waits quietly behind every breath. Silence becomes a teacher. Stillness becomes a scripture. The restless mind, once the master, slowly learns to bow. Moments of inward clarity arrive unexpectedly. A simple breath deepens and peace descends without invitation. A prayer ceases to be spoken and becomes a feeling. In such moments, the seeker understands that the search was never about acquiring something new, but about removing what concealed what was always present. Ignorance thins like mist before the rising sun of awareness. This awakening does not separate one from the world, it sanctifies it. Work becomes worship when performed with remembrance. Sorrow softens when seen as a passing cloud. Joy expands when no longer grasped but shared. The seeker learns to walk among duties while inwardly resting in freedom, to love without fear, to act without bondage. Thus the journey continues, step by step, breath by breath, guided not by force but by grace, not by ambition but by surrender, as the soul steadily rediscovers its eternal source within the boundless presence that has always been nearer than the nearest thought. There comes a moment in every life when the noise of the world can no longer drown out a quiet, persistent whisper arising from within. It does not announce itself dramatically, nor does it demand immediate obedience. It waits patiently beneath ambitions, beneath fears, beneath habits formed through years of outward living. This whisper is the soul's memory of its origin, a gentle reminder that life is more than survival, more than achievement, more than pleasure and pain alternating in endless cycles. When this inner call awakens, the individual may not immediately recognize it as sacred. It may first appear as restlessness, as a sense of incompleteness, as a subtle dissatisfaction that no external success seems able to resolve. Many attempt to silence this call by increasing their engagement with the world. They seek louder pleasures, greater recognition, deeper distractions, believing the unease will fade if life becomes full enough. Yet fullness of activity does not guarantee fullness of meaning. The soul is not persuaded by accumulation. It seeks resonance, not possession. Thus the inner call persists, sometimes growing stronger in moments of loss, failure, or quiet reflection. It is often suffering that loosens the grip of illusion, not as punishment, but as a compassionate redirection toward deeper truth. This awakening longing does not suggest rejection of life, but a desire to understand it. The soul does not ask to abandon the world, but to see it clearly. When the inner call stirs, familiar questions arise with new intensity. Who am I beyond my name and roles? What remains when achievements fade and the body weakens? Where does peace originate, and why does it vanish when sought through external means? These questions are not signs of confusion, but of maturity. The soul has begun to outgrow shallow answers. At first, the mind may resist this awakening. The mind is trained to measure, compare, and control. It prefers certainty over mystery. The soul's call, however, invites surrender rather than control, experience rather than explanation. This creates tension within, a struggle between habit and intuition. Yet even resistance serves a purpose, for it reveals how deeply the individual has been conditioned to seek fulfillment outwardly. Each moment of resistance brings awareness, and awareness weakens unconscious patterns. The inner call does not demand immediate perfection. It asks only for sincerity. A sincere heart becomes receptive to guidance that cannot be heard through noise. Gradually, attention begins to turn inward. Moments of stillness become attractive rather than uncomfortable. Silence is no longer empty but alive. In these moments, one may feel a presence that is intimate yet vast, personal yet universal. This presence does not speak in words, yet it communicates through peace, clarity, and a sense of belonging that does not depend on circumstances. As the longing deepens, the seeker begins to notice how fleeting external satisfactions truly are. Pleasure arises and dissolves. Praise excites and then fades. Possessions promise security but demand constant maintenance. This observation does not produce bitterness, but detachment. Detachment is not indifference. It is freedom from false dependence. The soul learns to appreciate the world without leaning upon it for identity or worth. The inner call refines desire, lifting it from the transient to the eternal. This awakening also transforms how one perceives others. The seeker begins to sense that the same longing stirring within is present, though often unrecognized, in every being. Compassion naturally expands not as a moral obligation, but as recognition. Differences of culture, belief, and behavior lose their sharpness when viewed through the lens of shared inner hunger. The soul recognizes itself in others, even when the mind disagrees. The path awakened by this call is not always gentle. Old habits resist dissolution. The ego fears its own transparency. Periods of doubt may arise, where the seeker questions whether the longing is real or merely imagination. Yet even doubt has its role, sharpening discernment and preventing blind belief. The soul does not ask for belief. It seeks realization. Every sincere effort, every inward turning, strengthens the connection between awareness and its source. Over time, the seeker discovers that the inner call was never separate from grace. Help appears in subtle forms, a timely insight, a chance encounter, a teaching that resonates deeply. These are not coincidences, but responses to alignment. When the soul listens, the universe replies. Guidance flows naturally when resistance softens. The journey becomes less about striving and more about allowing, less about becoming and more about remembering. The awakening longing also reveals the sacredness of ordinary life. Breath becomes a bridge between the visible and the invisible. Daily actions carry deeper significance when performed with awareness. Work ceases to be mere obligation and becomes an expression of inner order. Relationships become mirrors reflecting both attachments and opportunities for growth. Nothing is excluded from the spiritual journey, because the journey itself is the gradual recognition of unity within diversity. As attention stabilizes inwardly, the seeker begins to experience moments of profound peace that arise without cause. These moments do not depend on success or comfort. They appear unexpectedly, often in simplicity. Such peace feels familiar, as though returning home after long absence. It carries a quiet certainty that truth is not distant, not hidden in remote heavens, but present here and now, awaiting recognition. The inner call continues to guide without force. It does not shout commands or threaten consequences. It attracts through joy, through depth, through the promise of wholeness. Each time the seeker chooses awareness over distraction, sincerity over pretense, stillness over restlessness, the call grows clearer. The soul learns to trust this guidance, even when the path ahead is not fully visible, even when old certainties dissolve and new understanding has not yet fully formed. Eventually, the seeker realizes that the longing itself was the presence of truth calling to itself. The searcher and the sought were never separate. What seemed like a distant goal reveals itself as the very essence of one's own being, patiently waiting beneath layers of forgetting, gently awakening through the quiet, persistent call of the soul toward its own infinite depth. The moment a person turns inward, something subtle yet profound begins to shift. For years, perhaps lifetimes, attention has been trained to move outward, chasing meanings through objects, relationships, achievements, and beliefs borrowed from others. The world teaches this habit early, rewarding visible effort and measurable success, while the inner landscape remains largely unexplored. Yet there comes a time when outward motion no longer satisfies, when the heart senses that truth cannot be possessed like an object nor reached by distance. The realization dawns quietly that what is most essential cannot be found by moving away from oneself, but only by entering more deeply into one's own awareness. The outward search assumes that fulfillment lies somewhere else, in a future moment, a different place, or a perfected version of circumstances. This assumption fuels endless movement, yet rarely delivers lasting peace. The inward journey challenges this assumption at its root. It asks the seeker to pause rather than pursue, to observe rather than acquire. Such a pause can feel unsettling at first, because it removes familiar distractions. When external noise fades, inner patterns become audible. Thoughts, emotions, memories, and fears surface, demanding attention. Many mistake this initial turbulence for failure, unaware that it is simply the mind revealing what it has long concealed beneath activity. Turning inward does not mean rejecting the world or withdrawing from responsibility. It means shifting the center of identity from outer conditions to inner awareness. The seeker begins to notice that experiences change, but the one who witnesses them remains. Pleasure arises and passes, sorrow arrives and departs, yet something constant observes, both without being diminished or enlarged by either. This observation weakens the false belief that happiness depends on controlling circumstances. Freedom begins with the recognition that awareness itself is untouched by the fluctuations it perceives. As the inward journey deepens, the seeker learns that silence is not emptiness. Beneath the surface chatter of the mind exists a stillness that feels alive, attentive, and deeply intimate. This stillness is not created by effort. It is uncovered when effort relaxes. The mind, accustomed to constant motion, may resist this stillness, labeling it boredom or discomfort. Yet with patience, the seeker discovers that silence nourishes in ways stimulation never could. It restores a sense of wholeness that activity often fragments. The inward path also reveals how deeply identity has been entangled with roles and narratives. One has learned to define oneself by profession, relationships, successes, failures, beliefs, and opinions. When attention turns inward, these identities loosen. The seeker may feel temporarily unanchored, as if standing without familiar reference points. This disorientation is not loss, but transition. As external definitions fall away, a quieter, more spacious sense of self begins to emerge, one that does not depend on approval or comparison. Unlike the outward search, which is driven by desire and avoidance, the inward journey is guided by awareness. Desire seeks fulfillment through acquisition. Awareness recognizes fulfillment through understanding. This shift changes the quality of effort. Instead of striving to reach a destination, the seeker learns to remain present with each experience. The journey becomes less about becoming someone new and more about seeing clearly what already is. Each moment of honest observation, dissolves illusion more effectively than years of blind effort. The inward path also transforms suffering. Outwardly, suffering is often perceived as an obstacle to happiness, something to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Inwardly, suffering becomes a teacher. When observed without resistance, pain reveals attachments, expectations, and unconscious beliefs. It shows where the seeker has placed identity in the impermanent. This does not glorify suffering, but redeems it. Through understanding, suffering loses its power to define or imprison. It becomes a signal pointing toward greater freedom. As attention stabilizes within, the seeker becomes less reactive to the world. Events still occur, challenges still arise, but they no longer dictate inner state so completely. A space opens between stimulus and response. In that space, choice becomes possible. Actions arise from clarity rather than compulsion, from insight rather than habit. This inner freedom is subtle but transformative. Life feels less like a struggle against circumstances and more like a dialogue with experience. The inward journey also reveals the interconnectedness of all beings. When identity shifts from surface differences to shared awareness, separation softens. Compassion arises naturally, not as an obligation but as recognition. The seeker perceives that others act from the same mix of longing, fear, and conditioning that once governed their own behavior. Judgment gives way to understanding. This does not excuse harmful actions, but it changes the quality of response. Firmness can exist without hatred and boundaries without bitterness. Time itself is experienced differently on the inward path. The mind's obsession with past and future gradually loosens. Attention rests more frequently in the present, where life actually unfolds. The present moment reveals itself as sufficient, complete, requiring no improvement to be meaningful. This does not eliminate planning or memory, but it frees the seeker from living psychologically elsewhere. Presence becomes a refuge that can be accessed in the midst of activity, noise, and responsibility. The inward journey is not linear. Periods of clarity alternate with periods of confusion. Insights deepen, then seem to fade. This rhythm is natural. Each cycle brings understanding to a deeper layer of conditioning. The seeker learns patience, not as passive waiting, but as trust in an intelligence greater than personal effort. Growth continues even when progress feels invisible. What matters is sincerity, not speed. Gradually, the seeker realizes that the inward journey was never separate from life itself. Every interaction, every emotion, every challenge becomes material for awareness. Nothing needs to be excluded or rejected. The world becomes the classroom, and the inner presence becomes the teacher. The division between spiritual practice and daily living dissolves, leaving a simple attentiveness that permeates all actions. In this way, the inward journey reveals that what was sought outwardly, peace, fulfillment, meaning, was never absent. It was obscured by restless seeking, by the belief that truth must be elsewhere. As attention rests more steadily within, the seeker recognizes that awareness itself is the source of clarity, that the observer is not separate from what is observed, that the journey inward is not a movement towards something distant but a gradual unveiling of what has always been quietly present, waiting beneath thought, beneath identity, beneath the habit of looking away. When the noise of thought begins to soften, a new dimension of understanding quietly reveals itself. Silence, often misunderstood as absence or emptiness, is in truth a living presence that precedes words and outlasts them. It is not created by suppressing the mind, nor by fleeing from life, but by allowing attention to rest without grasping. In this resting, something essential is remembered, something that has always existed beneath the restless movement of thinking, waiting patiently for recognition. Stillness is not the opposite of action. It is the source from which right action naturally arises. When the mind is constantly agitated, perception becomes distorted, filtered through fear, desire, and habit. Silence clears these filters, not by force, but by transparency. In stillness, the mind ceases to interfere, and awareness sees directly. This direct seeing is not intellectual. It does not analyze or compare, it knows by being present. At first, silence can feel uncomfortable. The mind, accustomed to continuous stimulation, reacts with resistance. Thoughts grow louder, memories surface, unfinished emotions demand attention. Many interpret this as failure, believing that silence should feel peaceful immediately. Yet this turbulence is simply the mind revealing its contents once distraction is removed. The gateway to stillness requires patience, not judgment. Each moment of observation without reaction weakens the mind's compulsion to dominate attention. As the seeker remains with this process, silence begins to feel less like an absence and more like a gentle fullness. There is a sense of spaciousness, as though awareness has expanded beyond the narrow confines of personal identity. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer define the self. They pass like clouds across a vast sky, noticed but not possessed. In this space, a deeper intelligence becomes perceptible, one that guides without noise and corrects without criticism. Stillness reveals that peace is not something to be achieved through effort. Effort belongs to the realm of doing, while peace arises from being. The more one tries to manufacture calm, the more tension is created. When effort relaxes, peace emerges naturally. This does not mean abandoning discipline, but redefining it. True discipline is the willingness to remain present, to return again and again to awareness whenever the mind wanders. In silence, the seeker begins to perceive the subtle movements of inner life. The breath becomes a teacher, revealing the rhythm of existence. Each inhalation and exhalation mirrors the universal dance of creation and dissolution. Attention resting on the breath anchors awareness in the present moment, where silence lives. From this anchoring, insight arises effortlessly, like light filling a room when curtains are drawn back. Stillness also exposes the illusion of separateness. When thought subsides, the boundaries that define self and other soften. Awareness feels less confined to the body and more expansive, inclusive. This does not produce confusion, but intimacy. One feels connected without losing individuality, unified without being absorbed. This experience cannot be explained logically, yet it carries a certainty that reshapes perception. The gateway of silence transforms emotion as well. Feelings once resisted or indulged are now observed. Anger, fear, and desire are seen as energies moving through awareness, not as identities to be defended. In stillness, emotions lose their power to overwhelm, because they are no longer fueled by mental narratives. They arise, express, and dissolve naturally, leaving clarity in their wake. As silence deepens, the seeker notices a shift in motivation. Actions no longer arise from restlessness or lack, but from completeness. When one is inwardly still, there is no urgency to prove, accumulate, or escape. Work becomes more efficient, relationships more authentic, choices more aligned. Stillness does not withdraw energy from life, it refines it. Each action carries greater precision and less conflict. This inner quiet also sharpens discernment. Without the constant chatter of the mind, intuition becomes audible. Decisions emerge with a sense of rightness that does not rely on excessive analysis. This intuitive knowing is not impulsive. It is calm, grounded, and inclusive of consequences. It reflects a harmony between inner awareness and outer circumstances. Silence is not confined to formal meditation or secluded environments. Once recognized, it can be accessed anywhere. In the midst of conversation, activity, or challenge, a background stillness remains available. The seeker learns to act while remaining inwardly quiet, to speak while listening deeply, to move while rooted in awareness. This integration dissolves the false division between spiritual practice and daily life. The gateway of stillness also reveals impermanence with clarity. Observing thoughts and sensations arise and fade. The seeker understands directly that nothing external can provide lasting security. Yet this realization does not create despair. On the contrary, it liberates. When one stops clinging to the transient, appreciation deepens. Each moment is valued precisely because it is fleeting. Over time, silence becomes a trusted companion rather than an occasional refuge. It informs perception, steadies emotion, and guides action, The seeker no longer fears being alone, for silence is never empty. It is filled with presence, intelligence, and quiet joy. In this presence, questions dissolve rather than demand answers. Seeking softens into resting, effort into allowance. Through stillness, the seeker discovers that truth is not hidden in complexity, but revealed in simplicity. The most profound understanding does not shout, it whispers. It does not persuade, it illuminates. Silence becomes the language through which reality reveals itself, not as an idea to be believed, but as a living experience unfolding moment by moment within the vast, attentive quiet that had always been patiently waiting beneath the noise of the mind. Ignorance does not mean the absence of intelligence. It means the presence of misunderstanding. It is the habit of mistaking the transient for the eternal, the surface for the source, the reflection for the light itself. From this misunderstanding arises the sense of separation, the belief that fulfillment must be acquired, defended, or earned. The removal of ignorance is not an act of accumulation, but a process of subtraction, a gentle peeling away of false assumptions that obscure what has always been present and whole. Most ignorance operates unconsciously. One is rarely aware of it as it functions. It expresses itself through unquestioned beliefs, emotional reactions, and deeply ingrained identities. A person believes they are their body, their thoughts, their history, their social position. From these identifications arise fear of loss, craving for validation, and resistance to change. The world then appears as a field of threats and opportunities, rather than as a living expression of a deeper order. Ignorance is not darkness by itself. It is a veil that distorts perception. The process of removing this veil begins with observation. When attention turns inward, the seeker starts to notice how thoughts arise automatically, how emotions follow habitual patterns, how reactions occur before understanding. This noticing creates a subtle distance between awareness and experience. In that distance, the spell of identification weakens. One begins to see thoughts as events, not as commands, emotions as movements, not as definitions of self. As ignorance loosens, a quiet clarity emerges. This clarity does not arrive as dramatic revelation, but as simple seeing. The seeker recognizes that awareness itself is constant, while everything it observes is changing. Sensations shift, thoughts come and go, moods rise and fall, yet awareness remains untouched. This recognition undermines the belief that peace depends on controlling experience. Peace is seen as the nature of awareness itself, obscured only by misidentification. The removal of ignorance also exposes the illusory nature of fear. Fear thrives on imagined futures and remembered pasts. When awareness rests in the present, fear loses its foundation. This does not eliminate practical caution, but it dissolves psychological dread. The seeker understands that most suffering arises not from what is happening, but from resistance to what is. As resistance softens, acceptance arises not as resignation, but as alignment with reality. With ignorance receding, the sense of separation between self and world diminishes. The seeker perceives that the same intelligence animating their own being moves through all forms. This does not erase individuality, but it contextualizes it within a greater whole. The boundaries that once felt rigid become permeable. Compassion deepens not because it is commanded, but because separation no longer feels absolute. One's own well-being is intuitively linked with the well-being of others. This unveiling also transforms the understanding of action and responsibility. When identity is no longer anchored solely in ego, actions become less reactive and more responsive. The seeker acts from clarity rather than compulsion, from insight rather than fear. Mistakes may still occur, but they are met with learning rather than self-condemnation. Responsibility is embraced without burden, because action is no longer used to defend a fragile sense of self. The ever-present reality that reveals itself through this process is not distant or abstract. It is experienced as immediacy, as presence, as a quiet fullness underlying all experience. It is felt in the simplicity of breathing, in the clarity of perception, in the peace that arises when resistance dissolves. This reality does not compete with daily life, it supports it. Ordinary moments become luminous when seen without the distortion of ignorance. As layers of misunderstanding fall away, the seeker notices that happiness no longer depends on favorable conditions. Joy arises naturally from alignment with what is. This joy is not excitement but contentment. It is steady, inclusive, and resilient. It remains even amid challenge because it is rooted in understanding rather than circumstance. The seeker learns that loss affects possessions and roles, but cannot touch the essence of awareness. The removal of ignorance also clarifies the nature of desire. Desire is seen not as a flaw, but as misdirected longing. At its root, every desire seeks completeness. When completeness is recognized within, desire loses its compulsive edge. It may still arise, but it no longer dominates. Choices become more conscious, guided by wisdom rather than craving. Simplicity becomes attractive, not as denial, but as freedom. This unveiling process is gradual and compassionate. Ignorance does not vanish all at once. It dissolves in layers, each revealing subtler attachments. Patience becomes essential. The seeker learns to observe without impatience, to allow understanding to deepen at its own pace. Each moment of clarity prepares the ground for the next. There is no final conquest, only continuous revelation. As understanding stabilizes, life is no longer experienced as a problem to be solved. It is lived as an expression to be participated in. The seeker moves through the world with greater ease, guided by an inner alignment that does not depend on external approval. Challenges are met with presence, joys with gratitude, losses with acceptance. The ever-present reality shines through every experience, not as something added, but as what remains when distortion falls away. In this recognition, the seeker realizes that truth was never hidden, only overlooked. It was not distant, only ignored. The removal of ignorance does not create something new. It reveals what was always here, silently sustaining every breath, every perception, every moment of existence, waiting patiently to be seen as it is, whole, complete, and inseparable from the awareness that now recognizes it. To live in the world with inner freedom is not to escape responsibility, but to meet it without bondage. Most lives are shaped by unconscious reactions to circumstance, by inherited patterns of thought and emotion that dictate behavior without consent. Inner freedom begins when awareness steps back from these patterns and recognizes them as movements, not mandates. In that recognition, life is no longer something that happens to the individual, but something that unfolds through conscious participation. Remembrance is the quiet art of not forgetting what is essential amid the demands of living. It is easy to remember duties, schedules, ambitions, and fears, because the world constantly reinforces them. What is easily forgotten is the deeper presence that witnesses all experience without strain. Inner freedom grows as remembrance deepens, as attention returns again and again to that silent center from which clarity arises. This return does not require withdrawal from action. It requires only a willingness to remain inwardly anchored while outwardly engaged. When inner freedom is absent, the world feels heavy. Every task becomes a burden, every challenge a threat, every relationship a negotiation for security or validation. Actions are driven by fear of loss or desire for gain. In such a state, even success brings tension because it must be defended. With inner freedom, the same tasks are performed with lightness. The weight of psychological expectation lifts. Effort remains, but strain dissolves. One acts because action is needed, not because identity depends upon the outcome. Remembrance transforms work into expression. When attention is rooted in awareness, work ceases to be merely a means to an end. It becomes a channel through which inner order manifests outwardly. Precision increases, creativity flows more naturally, and fatigue lessens because resistance is reduced. The body may tire, but the spirit remains steady. Work performed in remembrance does not drain, it aligns. Relationships also change in the presence of inner freedom. Without remembrance, relationships are often used to fill inner gaps, to confirm worth, or to escape loneliness. Such use creates attachment and fear. With remembrance, relationships become spaces of sharing rather than dependence. One listens more deeply, speaks more honestly, and allows others to be as they are. Love becomes less possessive and more spacious. Conflict, when it arises, is addressed with clarity rather than defensiveness. Inner freedom does not eliminate emotion, but it alters the relationship to it. Emotions are no longer suppressed or indulged, they are observed. Joy is welcomed without clinging, sorrow met without resistance. This balanced attention prevents emotional states from hardening into identity. A person may feel anger without becoming angry, feel sadness without becoming sorrowful. This distinction preserves inner equilibrium even amid intense experience. Living with remembrance also reshapes decision-making. Choices are no longer driven solely by habit or impulse. A pause naturally arises before action, a moment of inward listening. From that listening, decisions emerge with a sense of coherence. Even difficult choices feel cleaner, less burdened by regret, because they are aligned with inner clarity rather than external pressure. Responsibility is accepted without resentment, because action flows from understanding. The world itself appears different through the lens of inner freedom. Circumstances are no longer interpreted solely as obstacles or rewards. They are seen as conditions within which growth and expression occur. Success is appreciated without inflation, failure met without collapse. Praise does not intoxicate, criticism does not devastate. The inner axis remains stable while outer conditions fluctuate. Remembrance also protects against the tyranny of time. Without it, the mind is trapped between regret and anticipation, rarely present. With it, the present moment regains its dignity. One plans when planning is required, remembers when memory is useful, but leaves where life actually unfolds. This presence brings a quiet richness to ordinary moments. Simple acts, walking, listening, breathing, carry a subtle joy when performed with awareness. Inner freedom does not imply withdrawal from society or indifference to injustice. On the contrary, it enables more effective engagement. Actions taken from clarity are less reactive and more precise. One can respond firmly without hatred, challenge without bitterness, serve without exhaustion. Remembrance keeps action rooted in wholeness rather than fragmentation, making service sustainable rather than sacrificial. As remembrance deepens, the sense of a separate doer weakens. Actions still occur, choices are still made, but they feel less personal. Life moves through the individual rather than being forced by them. This does not diminish responsibility, it purifies it. One takes responsibility for what arises, without claiming ownership of outcomes beyond control. This balance dissolves much unnecessary suffering. Living in the world with inner freedom also brings humility. One recognizes how little is truly controlled and how much unfolds through a larger intelligence. This recognition softens arrogance and self-blame alike. Gratitude arises naturally, not as a practiced attitude, but as a response to seeing life clearly. Even challenges are met with a quiet appreciation for their capacity to reveal deeper understanding. Over time, remembrance ceases to feel like a practice and becomes a way of being. It weaves itself into perception, guiding attention effortlessly back to the present. The world continues with its demands, its unpredictability, its beauty and pain, but the inner stance remains unshaken. Freedom is no longer postponed to some future condition. It is lived here within activity itself, as the steady awareness that remembers what it is even while moving, choosing, serving, loving, and responding moment by moment from a center that does not cling, does not resist, and does not forget itself even as it participates fully in the ever-changing flow of life.